I grew up in Martinsburg, West Virginia, which is really close to the border of West Virginia and Maryland. As a child, my dad took all of us kids, boy or girl, over to the wildlife preserve in Berkeley Springs to go hunting during the hunting season. It was a 15-minute drive from our house, which was convenient, but the preserve itself was gigantic. And back then, it wasn't even as close to fenced off as it is today. Dad hunted for all sorts of creatures back in '79, when there weren't many regulations to follow. We could go after whatever we wanted, whenever, and didn't matter how old we were. Usually my dad would get some deer and turkey and save the meat for future meals, but on this trip he was looking for bobcats to trade some fur in the area. As he always did, he got us up from our beds about 5 o'clock in the morning, handing us all some buttered toast and a glass of orange juice, and we were on our way, all 5 of us. Mom got to stay home with the new baby. The 2 kids under 13 didn't handle guns, so they stuck to Dad while he hunted. They just learned from him, as we all did. We 3 teenagers had rifles and were sent on our way. We knew the area like the back of our hands. We wandered off in different directions, all looking for bobcats. Dad said that he could get some good money for the fur, and since the holiday season was around the corner, we were itching to find as many as we could. I wandered south, away from everyone in my family. I was the middle child of the 5 on the trip. I was 13 and not the biggest hunting buff, but I still was willing to do whatever my dad told me. I was definitely the odd one out when it came to our very American heritage, but my family didn't bully me about it, and I could have said no if I didn't really want to go. I'd only been allowed to handle the rifle once before, but I knew how to handle it. I wanted to see if I could be like everyone else. I figured if I went in the opposite direction of everyone, the more bobcats there would be for me to hunt and grab. I passed a pond and a few other clearings, but then would be back in the thick of the woods. It was still early morning, about 7 a.m., when I finally came upon what sounded like an animal stirring in the bushes on a small rock path above my head. I hid myself against the rock to give the animal a chance to walk its way down to my level. After a few seconds, nothing. I was confused because I knew I heard something coming and there was only one direction it could come from. I thought I should take a look and see if I could shoot it quick from the level where I was standing. As I peeled away from the wall, I looked up and came face to face with what appeared, at first, to be a dog. The eyes, though, and some of the features were almost human. Its head was the size of 2 of mine and stacked next to each other. I was so stunned I couldn't even scream. I just dropped my rifle. The gun went off as it hit the ground. This irritated the beast because suddenly he began to sneer at me. He stood up on the edge of the rock to reveal how massive he was. He was at least 7 or 8 feet tall with claws that could rip me in half. His fur was black and matted like he hadn't bathed in months. His eyes never left me as he began to make his way down the rock to the forest floor. Even his feet were massive. I could hear his footsteps crashing into the ground. I began to hyperventilate. This was no wolf. This was almost werewolf-like. But it was a sunny morning and not a full moon. I could see him clear as day, and he made his way around to me. As he got within a few feet of me, I was unable to contain my fear any longer. I was only a kid. That's when I heard another bit of movement from the path I came from, followed by a familiar voice. It was my oldest brother. Before my brother was able to approach and see us both standing there, the creature looked in his direction and took off, climbing up a tree and out of sight. It happened so fast, but it felt like I had been standing there for a year. I was shaking, still staring up at the tree as my brother came over to me. He had to snap me out of it, grabbing my shoulders and saying my name over and over. He'd heard the gun go off and knew somebody had to be there. He wanted to see if we had caught something. He looked at my face, which was stained with tears. I didn't even know that I had cried. I couldn't speak. He guided me back to the main area where the truck was parked and stayed with me until everyone got back. When Dad saw me, he said it looked like I had seen a ghost. I told him I did. I never went hunting with them again, and no one ever mentioned seeing what I saw on any of their future trips. Luckily, Dad just chalked it up to hunting not being something I was meant to do. But really, that creature was so angry. I was afraid if it ever saw anyone with a rifle again, it would eat them whole. That experience completely reshaped my life. I'm the only one of my siblings that left West Virginia and moved to the city. I got my first real girlfriend at 17, Caitlin. We'd been dating for a few months and were at the point where we were always trying to find places to sneak away for privacy. Both of our parents were pretty strict about not having closed doors, so we had to get creative. Eventually, I remembered that there was an old farm next to my aunt's house across town. I'd played there a few times as a kid, and I knew there was an empty barn on the property. I was pretty sure it still wasn't being used. One Friday night, we went to check it out. We told our parents that we were going out to dinner and a movie. Instead, we got takeout and I drove us to my aunt's house. I parked down the street and cut through her yard. I brought a lantern and a few blankets for a picnic and possibly other things. My aunt lived on the edge of town, and her property and the farm next door were bordered by a decent-sized forest. It was definitely private. I was relieved to see that the barn was still there and didn't look like it was falling down. After a few tries, I was able to pry the door open. I turned on the lantern and looked around. It was rustic for sure, but at least it was dry. It smelled a little musty, but otherwise fine. We picked a spot in the far corner and set up the blankets and then our dinner. We'd just finished our meal when we heard a noise. It was a faint scratching sound. We bolted upright, looking around. I didn't want to tell Caitlin that there were probably rats in the barn, although that was my best guess. So I told her it was likely stray cats. But when we heard the sound again, it was coming from outside the barn, and it sounded big, not a rat or a cat. I got up with the lantern and peeked between the gaps in the wood slats. I didn't see anything, so I went back. The third time the scratching came, it was right behind us and much louder. Caitlin screamed and demanded that we leave. I wasn't ready to give up on our little hideout, so I offered to go outside and look. I used my phone flashlight and opened the barn door just enough to slip out. I walked around the perimeter of the building, but I didn't see anything, at least until I actually looked at the walls. There were huge scratch marks down the wood. The marks were deep and they looked fresh. I ran back into the barn and told Caitlin. We weren't sure what to do if something was out there. We had a long walk out in the open before we got back to my car, but I felt we were relatively safe in the barn since I could latch the door. We tried to figure out what might have made those marks. It was something bigger than a cat, that was for sure. The most likely answer was maybe a stray dog. It had smelled our dinner, maybe it wanted some. But in this part of Indiana, they were also bobcats, so that was a possibility. We waited a few minutes to see if we could hear the animal again. We decided if we didn't hear anything for more than 5 minutes, we'd make a run for it. 4.5 minutes, something banged on the door. We both screamed. It rattled the door and then it moved around the building, testing all the walls. At that point, we were scared enough to call for help, even if it meant getting grounded for sneaking out there. Caitlin suggested her older brother. He wouldn't tell our parents, and he was home from college for the weekend to do laundry. She asked him to bring a weapon and gave him directions. It would take him a good 20 minutes to get to us, though. We climbed up on the top of a built-in cabinet and stayed quiet, hoping that the thing would go away eventually. But there was a small hole in the wall near us. and I pressed my eye to it, watching outside. Up on the cabinet, I was about 7 feet off the ground, so when an eyeball looked back at me, I just about had a heart attack. I screamed and I scrambled back, almost falling off the cabinet. The eye had been orangish yellow, and it wasn't human. I freaked out, yelling nonsense at Caitlin, who was crying. I grabbed her and pulled her to the other side of the barn, inside an old horse stall. I tried to explain what I had seen, but she couldn't understand. She looked half like she didn't believe me and half petrified because of the look on my face. We stood in the corner, huddled together. There was a small gap between the boards on the outer wall there, too. I stayed away from it, having learned my lesson, but kept glancing at it. Sure enough, I saw a shape move past the gap. It was tall, confirming that it was the source of the eye I had seen, and it was looking for us. I had no idea how it could be so tall. Not even a human could be that tall. Anyway, I was sure the eye wasn't human. On the next pass, I saw a flash of fur, and I knew I was right. It wasn't human. I leaned forward a little, despite Caitlin's trying to pull me back, and just then a hairy hand reached through the gap, curling its long claws around the wood, trying to pull it off. We ran out of the stall and stood in the middle of the barn, trying not to hyperventilate. Luckily, just then we heard her brother calling for us. We ran towards the door and flung it open, knocking into him. He was holding a baseball bat and looking confused. I was just about to tell him to run when we heard the growling sound, and there, by the barn, was our stalker, the tallest creature I've ever seen standing on 2 legs, with a dog-like face, sharp teeth, and glowing eyes. It was staring at us, slowly looking back and forth between the 3 of us. It looked so strong and muscular that I was mesmerized, standing there looking back at it. Suddenly it raised its head into the air and sniffed in the direction of the forest. At the same time, Caitlin's brother hit us both and yelled, "Run!" We all sprinted for the cars without looking back. Caitlin left with her brother, and I sped home faster than I've ever driven on those back roads. The next day, Caitlin broke up with me, but we could never tell anyone why.